Hi, I am Alex Davidson, and I am in Miss Lowell's AP English Language and Composition class. The book that I chose was Number the Stars by Lois Lowry. I chose this book, Number the Stars, because I believe that it is a very passionate and insightful view into how the Holocaust affected not only the Jews, but their loved ones and friends, and also their families. I believe that it shows the ripple effect of the genocide by the Nazis and how loved ones were affected by the Nazis, who stripped the Jews effectively of their humanity, lives, and rights. This book is a significant piece of literature because it shows the resistance and unity of people who fought against the oppression of the Nazis. Oftentimes when history classes are taught, the Nazis are just brandished as terrible human beings who destroyed the Jewish race, and also just they completely exterminated everybody. But this shows the side of history that nobody really talks about, which is actually the resistance movement among that. And in this book, the Danish resistance movement is highlighted. This book shows a different side and perspective of history by showing the contrary side of the Nazi invasion and how people tried to save themselves and their families. So my introduction basically consisted of a summarization of the book and then included the major themes of the book. So my introduction was, Lois Lowry's 1989 historical film Number the Stars depicts the conditions of Nazi Germany and how the Jews had to find ways to live with, face, and hide from the persecution of the government and society while fearing for their lives. This novel portrays the difficulties of growing up and how children were forced to grow up in the context of World War II and take on responsibilities that can mean life or death for their loved ones. In this novel, 10-year-old Anne-Marie Johansson is forced to take on responsibility of supporting her and hiding her Jewish friend Ellen from the brutal Nazis that have taken over Denmark seeking to root out Jews. All while in mind, Anne-Marie is kept ignorant of most of the situation but is forced to step up and become brave while unknowing the extremity of the circumstances. Number the Stars encompasses 4 themes: bravery, true friendship and family, growing up, and sacrifice. So, as repeated, the major themes are bravery, true friendship, growing up, and sacrifice. Now, the major theme is probably salvation because that's what ends up happening, but these themes all tie in together to create the ultimate theme of salvation. These are just 4 major themes of it, and these themes all tie together because the actions of the main characters have to persevere through struggle, and each character goes through stages of bravery, has to go through true friendship, as well as growing up, which is what happens to the children of this novel, and sacrifice is pretty much a theme among all characters. One quotation that explains the circumstances of Anne-Marie's bravery was, like Anne-Marie, the reader is protected from the full implications of events, but will be caught up in the suspense and menace of several encounters with soldiers and in Anne-Marie's courageous run as courier on the night of the escape. So this was a source that was called Number the Stars by Kirkus Reviews. That was a quote by them. This is significant because it shows you how not only was Anne-Marie kept ignorant of the situation, but the reader also was. So it adds to the action and creates the ultimate theme of the fact that Anne-Marie had to be brave while on the run. She wasn't unknowing of any circumstances. She simply had to be brave in front of the Nazi soldiers. She had no idea what was going to happen to her because she was kept ignorant of the situation. In addition to that quote, there was also another quote that was by another website that explained Anne-Marie's bravery, which was, bravery meant the ability to stand firmly in front of the Nazis, who were monsters and not men, without trembling knees or a trembling voice or eyes that wandered into the distance. So the source that this came from was called It Was a Flood, a review of Lois Lowry's Number the Stars, and the people who made this quote was called TNB Nervous Breakdown. So this quote is significant because it shows how Anne-Marie, even as 10 years old, was able to stand in front of the Nazis, who were literally the genocidal humans of the World War II. They committed many war crimes, and they were killing her best friend. She didn't know it yet, but they actually had killed her sister Lise for being involved in the Danish resistance. They would later kill Peter, and Anne-Marie faced them without a single fear. I mean, she was nervous inside, but obviously none of her actions deterred her, so she acted normally, and she was able to achieve the ultimate goal, which was to give the package to her Uncle Heinrich. So it just shows that Anne-Marie had enough bravery to just stand there and not fold under the pressure of the Nazis, even when they were there. So basically, moving on to the theme of true friendship, there were a lot of quotes that represented true friendship because the friendship between Ellen and Anne-Marie was one of the most genuine friendships. They sacrificed everything for each other. They loved each other so much, which is why they were such a true friendship. And one quote from the book that represents their true friendship was a quote on page 49, which was, she looked down and she saw that she had imprinted the Star of David into her palm. So this literally and physically symbolizes the friendship between Anne-Marie and Ellen. That is because it shows the power of their friendship. So Anne Marie was a Christian and Ellen was a Jew. Obviously, Christians during this time were not persecuted, it was the Jews. But although that they were different, their power, their friendship was still together, even though they were different religions. So this necklace symbolizes the friendship with Ellen, Anne Marie's friendship with Ellen, showing that Ellen will forever be in Anne Marie's heart and the two will never be separated. So growing up was a very big theme in this novel because Anne Marie at 10 years old was forced to face unprecedented situations that many people in their lives won't face, never mind be 10 years old and be responsible for your friend's life in your hand. So at the hand of the Nazis, Anne Marie was forced to grow up, and at the hand of World War II. So one quote that definitely enhances the theme of growing up was by an article that was written, or an essay, that was written by Don Latham called Childhood Under Siege, Lois Lowry's Number the Stars, and also The Giver, but obviously we're only focusing on Number the Stars. And the quote that I found from this essay was, Lowry blurs the distinctions between her child protagonists and the adults around them. So basically, a lot of children have a lack of responsibility. However, Anne Marie was forced to gain responsibility. She was responsible for not only Ellen's life, but she was responsible for all of the people on the Uncle Heinrich's ship's life. She didn't know it at the time, but she figures it out later that she was responsible for all their lives, and had she not delivered the package, they most likely would have been dead. So the dire confrontation with the Nazis, she also had to grow up with them because nobody would be normally facing government officials, especially genocidal ones such as the Nazis. So at the hand of the Nazis, Anne Marie was forced to grow up. A quote from the book that represents Anne Marie's growing up is a quote when she was talking with her father about the disappearance of Mrs. Hirsch. Mrs. Hirsch was a lady who sold buttons on the corner street where Anne Marie and all of her friends and her sister would stop by. So Anne Marie in this book goes, is Mrs. Hirsch Jewish? Is that why the button shop is closed? Why would they do that? What harm is a button shop? Mrs. Hirsch is such a nice lady. This was on page 24, and this quote is significant to the theme of growing up because this is Anne Marie's first realization of the implications of war. Usually children are kept very ignorant about the bad things that happen because their parents like to shield them from the world and how bad it actually is. Children can get very overly emotional and not be able to process things maturely and correctly. But this is Anne Marie's first realization of what is actually happening, and from this realization of this quote, she later goes on to talk about how she goes, Papa, Papa, the Rosens, they're Jewish, what's going to happen to them? So this is Anne Marie realizing that her friends' lives are in danger, and even her parents tried to break it to her softly that the Nazis were going to be taking over the shops and taking over all the Jewish lives, but Anne Marie later does realize that her friend's life is indeed in danger. And as a 10-year-old, nobody wants to know that, and nobody really does know that, so this is why that encompasses the theme of growing up. Sacrifice is basically the ultimate theme of this novel because everything that Anne Marie and Ellen do basically sacrifice. They sacrifice for each other, they sacrifice for their families, they sacrifice for the greater good of the Jewish people. They sacrifice for their own being, their own will, their own knowledge. So one quote that I thought that was very significant to explaining why sacrifice was such a big theme in this novel was a quote by Gravesaver. And the quote was, in the end, every character has had to make a sacrifice for the greater good. This was an article titled Number the Stars Themes. So the plot of the story was the Johansen family was taking in Rosen while Uncle Heinrich, Peter, and Lise was her sister who later died because she was involved in the Danish resistance movement, worked in the Danish resistance to save thousands of Jews. And basically everybody had a sacrifice. The Johansens had to sacrifice their own lives by taking in Ellen and pretending that she was one of them. Ellen had a sacrifice because she was giving up her own family to be in safety, they thought was safety. Uncle Heinrich obviously was sacrificing his life because he was sacrificing his own supplies and materials, but also his life to deliver Jews across the bay into safety. And Anne Marie and Ellen, they were sacrificing their friendship because it's not every day that you find out your friend's life is in danger and how to react to it properly. And I thought Anne Marie did a very good job of sacrificing her life and sacrificing a lot of things to keep Ellen safe. So when you talk about the theme sacrifice, obviously Peter's life, it was revealed at the end that his life was taken away by the Nazis for being involved in the Danish resistance. So one quote that represents the sacrifice that he made was, and how devastating the day was when they received the news that Peter had been captured and executed by the Germans in the public square at Ryvegan in Copenhagen, which was on page 129. So in this quote, this is just what happened to her sister. Her sister was ran over by a tank for being involved by the Jewish resistance. And it was revealed that Peter's life was taken from him. So not only was the Johansons losing their own daughter, but losing their daughter's husband, Peter. So that just encompasses the theme that every character was sacrificing their lives. The Johansons may not have gotten caught. Uncle Heinrich may have not gotten caught. But Peter ultimately got caught, and they were all making the same risk by helping all the Jews. So that just really encompasses the theme of sacrifice. On YouTube, there was not a lot of videos that very much described the book without giving like just a summary of it. But one clip that I found was an interview of Lois Lowry with another person, and it was basically explaining why Lowry chose to write this book. And it was because she says that she was very impacted by her friend Anneliese Hendrickson, who had told her that she had grown up in Copenhagen, Denmark, where the Nazis did indeed knock on her door, and she had a friend. So they were just very much involved with each other. And Lowry wrote the perspective of a friend who would have been Anneliese's friend, because Anneliese went through very similar experiences in Denmark. So Lowry admits that these are different and fictional characters, but that they are inspired by her friend. And the reason why she wrote this book was because she believed that this was a story to be told, and that she learned about the Nazis in school, but that history was pretty much boring, so she didn't remember much of it. And there was also a different perspective, because a lot of people just get told the basic story of how the Nazis were killing all of the Jews, but nobody really hears about the resistance movement against it. And Lowry thought it was important to communicate this with her audience. And obviously, as a bestseller, this message has been communicated with a lot of people, and now people know that there was in fact resistance to the Nazi movements.
Number of the Stars, so what actually inspired that?
Well, Number of the Stars, as you know if you've read the afterword of the book, was sort of inspired by my friend Anneliese Platt, whose maiden name was, I think, Anneliese Henriksen, who grew up in Denmark while I was growing up in Pennsylvania during World War II. Our childhoods were so similar in many ways and so different in others. I was affected by the war because my father was in the Pacific during the war, and I knew that my mother worried, but the war was very distant from me. And when I met Anneliese as an adult, and she talked about her childhood, where Nazis were on the street corners in the town where she lived, I realized how different it was. And when she told me what had happened in Denmark, I realized that that was a story to be told for kids. I think I probably had heard about it in a history class, but I hadn't remembered it because it had been taught as part of a history course. And it was therefore, forgive me, boring. And I knew if it were told as a story, it had all the elements of a wonderful story. The suspense, the danger, and at the same time, the enormous courage and integrity. And so I created the little girls in the book. They're fictional characters, but I set them down on a street where Anneliese had lived, in the city where she had grown up. And at the time, October 1943, those 2 weeks in which those events happened in Denmark. I'm so gratified that it's been such a successful book, not for my own sake, but because it means that everywhere, and I mean all over the world because it's translated into a lot of different languages, everywhere kids are learning about integrity and about the kind of courage that they showed in Denmark and the lack of discrimination that they always had in Denmark.
The other source that I found was a book talk by someone named Megan Day, and she basically explains how Lowry uses ethos to communicate with her audience that there was obviously high emotions in this time, and that the book appeals to the emotions of the readers and shows the dire situation of how bad the Holocaust actually was. So Lowry wrote this story with the purpose of explaining what would actually happen, because she said before that she knows that everybody knows history, but that history can be boring sometimes, and she wanted to show the actual resistance movement. So her ethos that she used in here appeals to the emotion of the reader and gets them to see how dire the situation of the Holocaust actually was. So the talk starts off with explaining basically the innocence of a little girl, imagining a little girl frolicking around doing as she pleases. Then imagine that same little girl having to face Nazis, having to know her life was in danger, as well as her best friend. So this book talk basically just goes over the main points of the book and explains how it relates to historical fiction purpose and also social studies. And she explains how people should read this book because it not only is a good novel just for like reading purposes, but it also relates to social studies because it shows the account that most people aren't aware of, that people did in fact fight against the Nazis and resist against their oppression.
In your mind, a 10-year-old little girl and the interests she may have: racing outside with her friends, playing outside, or maybe playing with dolls. Now, imagine that same little girl living in a country that's been overtaken by Nazi soldiers, war, and the fear of rationing food and electricity. This was the life of the fictional character in this book, Number the Stars. Anne-Marie is a 10-year-old little girl living in Denmark in 1943. The book was written by Lois Lowry. Now, Lois Lowry admits the characters in this book are fictional, but she dedicates this book to her friend who actually lived in Copenhagen, Denmark during the German occupation. This book has a lot of historical events woven through the pages in a very captivating way that I think your students would enjoy. In this book, Number the Stars by Lois Lowry, the main character is Anne-Marie, a 10-year-old little girl. Now, Anne-Marie was old enough to remember the time before the Nazi soldiers were in her town. She remembers some of the times where she could play outside carefree, enjoy desserts, and the simple pleasures of being a child. She longed for those days to return in this book. Anne-Marie has a younger sister in the book named Kirsty, and Kirsty is a little too young to actually remember the days before the Nazi Germany soldiers arrived. Now, Kirsty has a childlike wonder and innocence that serves itself well in this book, as you'll find out. Kirsty also has a stubborn and outspoken personality like many little sisters do. In Number the Stars, Anne-Marie just wants to be a kid again and play outside with her best friend Ellen. Ellen Rosen is the character that plays as Anne-Marie's best friend. They live in the same apartment building and their families are very close. Anne-Marie questions the idea of bravery in this book and whether or not she is brave. I hope you'll read this book to find out how brave Anne-Marie is and to hear a story of true friendship through difficult times. I think this book would be a great choice for historical fiction in a 5th grade classroom. Social studies standards in Tennessee in 5th grade include explaining the structure and goals of the government in Germany after the 1930s and analyzing the significance of the Holocaust. Number the Stars also ties into the National Council for the Social Studies themes with themes such as people, places, individual development and identity, and power and authority. I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book, and I think you and your students would too. I think it's age appropriate for older elementary, and it presents some of the events of World War II, but also at a level that's appropriate for their age. I think it would provide a lot of good opportunities for discussion starters and some background knowledge for your students. I hope you enjoy reading Number the Stars by Lois Lowry.
So my conclusion basically just summed up the major thoughts I had of this book, and I concluded with the fact that ultimately each theme of this novel ties together to create the plot and to house the eventual goal of salvation for the Jews in Denmark. For Anne-Marie and the Johansons, the goal was to save Ellen Rosen and her family. For Peter and Uncle Heinrich, the goal was not only to save the Rosens, but to save as many Jews as possible. Each character portrayed different elements and situational characteristics of the major themes. The overall theme of this novel is salvation, encompassing major themes of bravery, true friendship, growing up, and sacrifice. So basically, salvation was one of the major goals because each event that happened led to the higher event of saving the Jews, saving the Rosens, saving a select group of people, and each character in the novel basically demonstrated bravery in many different ways. True friendship was demonstrated between the Rosens and the Johansons, as well as just Peter and Uncle Heinrich's unity with the Jews, and also an overall friendship of the Catholics and the Jews. It just shows the major theme that all these themes are coming and tying together. Growing up was obviously with all the children. Kirsty, who is Anne-Marie's sister, she faced growing up a little bit. She needed to learn how to stop using her demeanor and opening her mouth so much. Anne-Marie obviously had to grow up a lot. So did Ellen. They had to be more mature in these situations, and they had to learn not to mess up. And sacrifice was obviously the quintessential theme besides salvation that I thought, because everybody was sacrificing everything for each other and for the greater good of everybody else. So some of the sources that I had was, one of them was called The Real Life Story Behind Number the Stars. This was by Eric Blackmore, and it was published by JustStore Daily in 2017, and it was last accessed on December 23rd, 2022. The other source that I had was by Don Latham. It was Childhood Under Siege, Lois Lowry's Number the Stars, and The Giver. This was published by The Lion and the Unicorn 26 in 2002, and it was accessed on December 23rd, 2022. So the main source that I used was obviously Lois Lowry's Number the Stars. It was published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt in 1989. Another source that I had was by Micah McCreary. It was a review of Lois Lowry's Number the Stars. This was published by TNB Nervous Breakdown in 2014, obviously accessed December 23rd, 2022. Another source that I have was by Kirkus Reviews. It was called Number the Stars, and it was published in 2011, and it was last accessed on December 23rd, 2022. Another source that I have was called Number the Stars Major Themes by Cliff Notes, and it was accessed again on December 23rd, 2022. And the last source that I had was called Number the Stars Themes by Grade Saver, and it also was last accessed on December 23rd, 2022.